Hello, everyone. Welcome to WOTS Weekly Features. Today's guest is Nathan Niigan Noodin Adler, artist, filmmaker, and author of Ghost Lake. We'll be talking about his book and how his Indigenous heritage informs and models his storytelling. I'm Yeli, and I'll be your host. WOTS Toronto operates on land that is the territory of the Huron-Wendat and Paytun First Nation, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation. This territory is the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Confederacy of the Anishinaabeg and Allied Nations to care for and share the resources around the Great Lakes in peace. We encourage you to educate yourself about the land you live on, wherever you're tuning in from. Before our guest, Nathan Niigan Noodin Adler is a writer, artist, and filmmaker who works in a variety of mediums, including audio and video, and drawing and painting. Nathan is the first place winner of an Aboriginal Writing Challenge and recipient of the Natashan Reveal Award for Literature. He has an MFA in Creative Writing from UBC, BFA in Integrated Media from OCAD, and a BA in English Literature and Native Studies at Trent. His writing is published in various magazines, blogs, and anthologies. He is author of Wrist, an Indigenous horror novel published by Kegedonce Press, and co-editor of Bawajigan, Stories of Power, a dream-themed anthology of Indigenous writers published by Exile Editions. Nathan is Two-Spirit, Jewish, Anishinaabe, and member of the Lakhdamilk First Nation. Originally from Ontario, he currently resides in Vancouver. Thank you so much for joining us, Nathan.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me.
A little birdie also told us that Gold Lake was awarded the 2021 Indigenous Voices Award in published English prose very recently, so congratulations.
Thank you.
It seems like everybody's just been buzzing about Ghost Lake recently, so I'm really excited to dive into it and chat about it.
Cool. I think winning an award helps bring the book attention, right? Because it's good advertising, right?
Totally. So let's just jump into it. Could you tell us, I guess, a little bit about the inspiration behind some of the stories and the genres in Ghost Lake?
Sure. So they kind of run through a bunch of different genres. So there's like the first story in the collection is more like a erotica. But then some of the other ones are more like thriller and mystery, like keep you on the edge of your seat, and other ones are more speculative. Well, most of them are actually speculative fiction, which is like horror, urban fantasy. So there is a kind of like range of like speculative fiction genres that I kind of explore in this. One's a bit kind of sci-fi, but not really. And then there's like a historical fiction one that is a pre-colonial story set in the far past. And then there's one that's more like a straight up horror, like another one that's like more closer to like a mystery where you're following the character solve a crime. So I was really playing with different spec genres because that's the genre I like to read, and also because I was writing short stories and I didn't know when I was writing them that they would end up being a book. I was just writing different stories, so they all kind of so I was exploring different storytelling kind of conventions, and then when it came to gathering them to a book, the connecting thread between them was the setting, which is Ghost Lake. And I mentioned this before, but after I had written my first novel, I was kind of like wasn't ready to tackle writing another novel, so that's how I ended up writing short stories. Because it was just I wasn't ready to start a big project like that. The other easier thing was for me to set it in the same location as Risk, because I'd already done all the work of world building and imagining this kind of speculative world and the rules in which the kind of universe operates. So then it was just easy for me to create the characters in that world that are already kind of imagined, rather than kind of creating an entirely new fictional universe. So that's how I ended up with this book.
Awesome, yes.
That's a bit about some of the genres that I cover anyway.
So that was going to be one of my follow-up questions, is how you managed to kind of piece together all of these very different genres. But it sounds like that thread, like you said, that connects them all really is Ghost Lake, the location.
Yeah. I was really struggling with the title because I was like, what do I call it? And I just had all these different options, and I was, me and my brother, he was helping me. We were just writing down all these different possible titles, and they were all terrible. And then the only thing that fit was Ghost Lake. That was the only thing that made sense to me. So that's how we ended up with Ghost Lake.
Very fitting.
Yeah. And but yeah, it is really about the setting, because it feels like a character in its own right. That's kind of appearing throughout the book, so you really get a sense of the place. And some of the characters reappear. So one character, Zod, she has 3 short stories. Like it's from her point of view, and then so it's spread out. And then some of the other characters have like 2 stories, or and they appear as little, and each character that has the point of view following them in one story, they'll appear as a minor character in a story like 3 stories down, or in a couple other stories they'll appear as secondary characters. So as you're reading, it feels like the people are just popping in and out of each other's kind of stories a little bit, so it kind of feels a bit more like one cohesive narrative where you're in the same place. So a character that's is the star in one story, they'll just be like a minor character that's mentioned in another one. So it really creates a real cohesive kind of thing, which is something I liked in other short story collections I've read, when they feel like really knitted together. So they might explore slightly different genres, but there's still a lot holding it together as well.
Definitely. I got that feeling when I was reading it, that I could sense that, oh, maybe this character knows of this other character, and I felt that interconnection between them. Could you tell us a little bit more about the thought behind writing those characters specifically? Because there's lots of strong protagonists in a lot of these stories, whether or not they're queer or femmes, or, you know, a bunch of different characters.
Yeah. So, I mean, each character is pretty different, but for some of them, I was trying to, well, I wanted the female characters to be like strong, powerful women. So like I wanted to them, especially for some of them where they were like really dealing with some like heavy issues. So I wanted them, like for hydrangeas, I really wanted that character to be like a superhero almost. She's like a vigilante, kind of seeking justice kind of character. So I was really thinking like Quentin Tarantino, badass kind of like character. So that's kind of what I was going with her. But then some of the others are more like the first story is much more psychological. It really is about that one's really just like delving into his psychology and kind of figuring out like why he is the way he is, kind of thing. And that one's also erotica, so it's like, and it has the least amount of like kind of like supernatural kind of elements in it. So it really is more like, and that's the first book. So it starts very like only small little hints of maybe supernatural stuff, and then those kind of spirit elements and things kind of weave their way in. But I always also try to keep them a little bit like up in there, whether they're real or not. So you never know whether things are real or where you are, and like that tension between things that are real and that aren't real, and then you never know where you are in terms of like genre a little bit.
Yes.
I like playing with those kind of like that skepticism that people have, and then mirroring that in the fiction helps people get into the book, or into the story, because then the characters are all also skeptical. So then if you're skeptical, you kind of like, okay, yeah, I could go along with it because they're skeptical too, and so it helps with the suspension of disbelief.
Yeah, Yes, there's a couple of stories where I had to kind of go back and reread the last couple of pages and ask myself, oh, did this actually happen? Or so there's lots of supernatural elements like that that definitely ring true. Could you maybe talk to how those supernatural or the horror elements in there maybe work as an allegory? Like, are any of them based in real world events or real world anxieties?
Well, I think monsters in themselves, like often they work like supernatural creatures, and like werewolves, vampires, wendigos. Like a lot of monsters work really well as allegories, so that you can explore real world issues. So like there's like the whole zombie genre thing is, um, the whole zombies walking around a mall is kind of like kind of a critique of capitalism, right? Which is so, and then so for Wrist, it was I was using working with the cannibal monster, the Wendigo. So that monster I was kind of using that monster in a similar way to the zombie monsters that are used in a lot of movies. So I was like exploring greed and the idea of capitalism and greed and how those are kind of fused together. And I didn't have much Wendigo stuff in this book because a little bit. One of the characters from this book does appear in this book. So, but I was trying to explore different monsters. So I guess the real world monsters in here is that there is that tension between also social realism and genre fiction. So things that are real world like real realities for people, like dealing with like missing and murdered women and stuff, and then that being a reality, but then writing a genre fiction story about that. So then there's a tension of that being a real reality, and then this being a fictional story, right? So in that story, I didn't want to have it. There's no shades of gray in that story. It's like there's a bad guy, he's the bad guy, and then there's no empathy for him. He's just crazy. I'm like, okay, this isn't his story. He's just the bad guy. So in that way, it was kind of Quentin Tarantino-ish. But other monsters that kind of I'm trying to think what other monsters there are. I guess that's the main one that has like real world reference to like reality in it. But monsters are a good way of like kind of exploring different ideas. I guess the other one is the ghosts in Intermediaries. So that's the longest story in the book. It goes, it's from page 191 to 269. So it's more like a novella almost. So and it's because it has three characters, then each of their narrative arcs are kind of interwoven together like this. And then the ghosts in that story, they were really, I was really exploring the tropes in mainstream horror, but surrounding like the Indian burial ground trope, which is common in like Pet Sematary and a bunch of The Shining and a bunch of other kind of horror movies from the 90s and 80s. So those tropes in horror, because I write horror, I wanted to like kind of deconstruct them and turn them into something else while still kind of following the horror genre trope. So it's a ghost story, but then I'm doing it a little bit different. So the ghosts aren't evil or mindless spirits. They're not the cause of the haunting. The living people are the ones who are disturbing them and causing the ruckus. And like, so I'm kind of telling it in a different way. So I'm taking it's still a horror kind of story, but it's because it has those conventions, but it's I'm not following the trope. I'm using the tropes and flipping them on their head, kind of thing.
Yes, absolutely. So we've talked a little bit about current events and current world anxieties. But how a lot of your stories in this book, or a couple of them at least, rang very hopeful to me near the end a little bit. So how can the use of literature and horror be used to address this trauma, but also still be forward-looking and hopeful in that way?
Well, for me as a writer, I think like working through like trauma, whether you're exploring an issue about real world trauma or you have your own trauma that you're dealing with, a lot of writers they are dealing with those historical impacts of colonial violence and colonial history, and so a lot of people get stuck into exploring like impacts of colonialism in their work, and that's kind of unavoidable in some ways. But then there are other stories to tell too. Like you don't always need to get. This is something from my own kind of approach. Is that I didn't feel like I always wanted to get stuck into always exploring that kind of trauma and colonialism. So one way that I was kind of thinking outside of that was like, okay, well, I'll set this story in the pre-colonial past, so it can't have any reference to like current stuff. So it's just straight up historical fiction. Of course, it does end up having all kinds of references and allegories and stuff to modern traumas and issues, but this is one way of kind of like sidestepping the issue a little bit and just being like, I just want to tell this other story that doesn't reference being sad about things all the time. So that was kind of one approach, and some of the other ones, I think I was doing something similar and not and not trying to directly approach things like that. And you thought it was hopeful, eh?
A couple of them, yes,
Okay.
definitely.
I know my story in Josh's book. Where is it? I have that here. Maybe I don't have a copy, but Love After Then. That story was very more hopeful because it was set in the future. That was another strategy I used in that story. Was, well, you set it in the far distant future, and then you can imagine things being a lot better than they are, right? So that's another approach you could take. So
yes. Well, so I'm just sifting through my book here right now, but I guess the story that I thought was hopeful specifically was Under the Ice, how it kind of ends off with him, not to be too spoilery, but they, get this dog at the end, and he's kind of reflecting, or she's reflecting about her brother that's been lost. I found that in particular was very forward-looking and hopeful too.
Okay.
The future.
Yeah. She has another story that's like further at the end too. Offerings is one from her point of view too, and that's so it jumps ahead like to in the future, so in like a year, and she's lost her grandmother in that story, and then she's dealing with that loss, and then but it's also a straight up horror movie because there's like bumps and noises, and she's home alone, and it's like the standard kind of like horror movie beginning to like Scream or something. It's very very much in that horror genre, but then it also ends up being this connection to her grandmother instead of it's still creepy and scary, but then it does have that little bit of so in some twisted way, it ends up being like a way for her to connect with her grandmother. So in that way, that story ends on a hopeful note. And I guess her other story kind of ends in a similar way, in that the dog is kind of operating in a similar way, in that it's connecting to her from the loss of her brother. So both stories were dealing with the ideas of loss and connection. And both were also very genre fiction-y.
Yes. Oh my gosh. I'm about halfway through, so I can't wait to get to that second story of hers now. I'm excited.
All right. Yeah. And then even with those, I try to keep the reality versus whether supernatural things are real or not. I didn't want to answer that straight out. You never know what space you're in, whether the supernatural elements are real, maybe they're not, and then you're left in this space of limbo where it's up to you to decide. So the reader never gets like a definitive answer, and I like that tension And it also maintains a suspension of disbelief. So then you can read the story. Okay, there might have been something supernatural elements, and it's using all those genre fiction stuff, conventions. But then you still don't know what's real and what's not, and then the character doesn't either. So it's kind of like ramming you into their shoes a little bit. So you're in their you're in the same headspace as them, not knowing what's real and trying to work your way through things. So.
Absolutely. A lot of it is very much a mystery.
Yeah.
Let's see. I wanted to talk about you do something in this anthology, which I love to see when writers do it, which is, so when I took a creative writing class, I learned that you italicize words that are in a non-English language, and that always rang very inauthentic to me. And I noticed that in this book, a lot of the English words are actually italicized, and all of the non-English words are just, plopped in. Could you talk about whether or not that was a conscious decision, or talk about more of that language integration?
Yeah, for sure. I learned the same thing actually. Like, okay, non-English words, you italicize them, and then English words you just leave non-italicized. But I thought, well, I don't want to do that, so
Yes.
so I just didn't. So I just I would italicize. I wanted people to. I didn't want the language to be a barrier, because a lot of people don't speak their languages, and they want to I'm not fluent either, so I wanted the language used to feel very natural and embedded in the text, but also very like a way of learning too, because it is a way of learning for me. So when I use a word, it's I'm learning it, or I just learn, or I learned it from one of my cousin or my mom or my grandma or something. So it's a word I'm using so that I can use it, and so I can remember it, and it's a way of learning. And then when I embed it in the text, and it just it's there, but I don't want to have it italicized as a foreign word, because it's I feel like it's my word. It's so I don't want to italicize it as something foreign, so I make it not italicized, and then the translation is not always there, but sometimes I'll have the English in italicized, because that's the translation of the word, not the other way around. And sometimes I won't translate it, and I'll just leave it there if it's clear. Sometimes it's obvious by context. You can kind of just figure out what the meaning is, so you don't really always need a translation either. So you can just, if it's clear from context, then it's already explained.
Excellent. So, okay, we've talked a lot about genre, and I've noticed that in the past several years, there's been a lot of Indigenous speculative fiction that's been coming out. How does that genre of speculative fiction lend itself to writing stories in ways that other genres don't? Why not write historical fiction and all of those different genres instead?
I mean, I do write historical fiction. I mean, some of it, like one of the stories in here was pretty historical, and Wrist itself has a whole, one of the subplots. The historical timeline plot is all historical fiction. So you can blend genre fiction with historical fiction, and but I think the rise in genre fiction for Indigenous writers, I think it's just that we're getting published more often. Like there's more Indigenous writers getting published, so then our stories are getting told, basically.
Yeah.
So yeah, and I think Drew Hayden Taylor mentioned this, and how those aspects of genre are traditional, like that traditional stories have all these elements of whether it's sci-fi or horror or alternative history. Like our traditional stories have those elements, so I don't think genre fiction isn't like new to storytelling traditions. They're just it's just that our stories are getting told more now, or we're getting published. So some of those stories will be science fiction, some of them will end up being have more like gothic or macabre kind of elements, and so it'll run towards horror. So, but I do think genre fiction itself is good at exploring different things in literary fiction often. So you can do things in genre fiction that you can't. Genre is known for being very plot heavy and less character focused. So if you want to have like just an action packed kind of like narrative, you can do that and less focused on like character. But I like to have both. So I really like to have the literary fiction aspects where there's a really strong character development and character depth. But then I also like having it actiony and plot, like having the plot pretty like punchy. So you're not, because I like to be entertained too when I'm reading a book, or reading a story. So I want it to be an actiony plot. And then also, but I also want some of the literary elements, like the literary fiction, where it's a bit, it's not as shallow as some genre fiction can get. Some genre fiction is known to be like, oh, it's just like, it's all just plot and it's all just action and there's not much depth to it. But and then there's this idea that you can't have that in genre fiction. But of course you can.
Yes.
Yeah, of course you can.
Amazing.
It just depends on the writer and what kind of stories they want to tell, right?
Before we wrap up, is there anything else that you would like to chat about that we haven't already explored or delved into?
Guess we could talk about the beautiful cover and the art inside. Yeah, the cover was they kind of took my input into like how they wanted it to look, and so I was like, oh, let's put lightning, let's put a fire, let's put so then, and they wanted it to match the cover for wrist. So they wanted the layout to be similar, so it has a similar sky, trees kind of foreground, and then it wraps around the back, both of them, because they're companion volumes. They wanted them to look really similar, but they wanted a different color scheme, so it wouldn't be too much the same. And then we were working with the designer, and she was taking my input into account. So I'm like, oh, like, can we do this? Can we do that? So let's put stars. And then the text was different originally, and I didn't like the text. So I was like, oh, let's do like a more of a vintage horror movie font. So I sent them a bunch of like horror movie covers, and like, let's do something along these like horror movie poster fonts. And then so that's how we ended up with this. It was like kind of like we drew inspiration from those, and then I really like the lightning on the shiny
lightning. Yeah. I don't know if it translates to camera, but it glimmers a little bit.
Yeah, it kind of shines. It's like embossed, and then it's got a monster on the cover, which matches from wrist. And then the interior design too is actually really beautiful, because each the pages from each chapter heading has this nice graphic, which is from the cover, and then each story itself, I drew these little tiny icons for each chapter. So each chapter, so you can, I don't know if you can see, there's like a little tiny fire. So each chapter, I drew a little kind of icon that could be used as a divider between paragraphs. Because I'm kind of a fan of like what's his name? Like the Wheel of Time, where they have like each chapter, it flips from character to character, and each character has their own little like symbol that represents them. So I was doing a geeky. I wanted to do something geeky like that, where each character had like a little something to like that was related to the theme. I mean, they're not illustrations. They're more just like little dividers between like sections. So if there's a
I didn't know that you did those. That's amazing.
Yeah, they included. I did my little my little drawings. They included, which is great. So I just like the way that the book turned out. Like visually, it's a beautiful book. And then which is great. And then also, where is it? I think there's, but yeah, so I just I just think it's a really beautiful book, and people should check it out if they want.
Definitely. Thank you so much for joining us today, Nathan. This has been a great chat, and I can't wait to get to the rest of those awesome stories.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the book.
Thank you. All right, to order your copy of Ghost Lake and for more Indigenous reads, go to kegedonce.com. This has been today's WOTS Weekly Feature. Tune in next week for Multiculturalism Week with our special guests, Playwrights Press and the Japan Foundation. For discounts and deals, check out toronto.thewordonthestreet.ca/weekly-features. From all of us at WOTS, happy reading.